You've shown us some of these amazing specimens where there's for example, like a tooth stuck in a tail, and it seems just absurd that you could find one of these. So are these kind of bones found just by chance, or is there really are they really trying to look in specific places to look for these fossils?
Unfortunately, there's no really concerted effort. Fossil hunting, this is one of the great aspects of my job, I think, is that what I do now as a paleontologist when I'm out hunting fossils is what my academic and predecessors did anything up to 150 years ago, which is you just kind of walk around and look. Despite, again, what Jurassic Park promised of ground-penetrating radar and various other things, they just don't work very well at all. And the way we find fossils is to go to areas where we know there are dinosaurs and look for dinosaurs. That really is the limit of the technology. It's walking around and looking. And therefore, you really are not selective in what you're finding. Your choice when you find something is to either go to the trouble of digging it up and collecting it, or leaving it and moving on to something else. And we do leave things. We don't always have the time or money or effort to collect things if they already look very badly damaged. Some very well-known species. I've spent some time working in Mongolia and China, and there's a thing called Protoceratops, and there are hundreds of specimens of Protoceratops in museums now. They're extraordinarily common. If you find one and it doesn't look like a very nice one, there is no point investing 3 or 4 days in digging it up. It's not going to add anything to our scientific knowledge, so sadly you tend to leave it. But it means things like this are almost always serendipitous. You're just hoovering stuff up and hoping that if you hoover enough stuff up, you'll find something that interesting.
So if any of us want to go on a holiday to China, there may be some dinosaurs waiting for us to take home with us then.
Oh, it's easy. Not that you could export it from China.
Okay, do we have any questions up?
I think you probably do.
Yep.
Do we have any idea what they use their silly little arms for?
That's one area I didn't cover, and partly because the answer is always complicated, but mostly the answer is probably not very much at all. Generally, when you see something like this shrinking and reducing, it's because it's not being used, and evolution is basically selecting against it. There's no point growing a giant arm that you can't use. One of the things I mentioned was, even though these look quite vicious, the claws of the later tyrannosaurs are less curved and therefore less sharp than we see in earlier ones. They also have these pits to which attach ligaments, and these pits are getting shallower and shallower and shallower. That suggests they have less and less attachment, less and less stress is going through them, and therefore they're not being used. So it's not just the size, actually. There are some subtleties to the anatomy, all of which point to the arms doing very little. Even all the jokes that get made about T-Rex, Tarbosaurus has even smaller arms. And there's actually a whole other group of dinosaurs, all of which reduce their arms down as well. So it's not just the Tyrannosaurs. There's a couple of other big-headed carnivores that did the same thing. So my best guess is very, very little.
Okay, Joe, have you got one up here?
Was the Tyrannosaurus Rex a cannibal, and did it eat its own children?
Eating its own children, we don't know. We have very few juvenile tyrannosaurs, and it's very hard to say about some complicated behavior. Were they cannibals? Yes. Yes, they were. So there are now 2 Tyrannosaurus bones, both of which have feeding traces on them. And again, as I say, one of the reasons I personally like to work on Tyrannosaurus, because I do loads of work on bite marks and feeding traces, is because it's the only thing around. If you find a bone with bite marks on it, seriously, you've got Tyrannosaurus, and then the next biggest thing in its environment is a Dromaeus, or a close relative of Velociraptor, about this big. So any bite mark bigger than this tooth was, by definition, T-Rex. It's actually really, really useful as a deductive reasoning standpoint. And we have several Tyrannosaurus bones with big bite marks on them. Well, the only other thing capable of doing that is another T-Rex. And they do appear to be feeding traces. There's loads of evidence of combat. So loads of them have beaten up heads with healed marks, but these look like feeding marks. And therefore, yeah, they were eating each other. And that's, again, not uncommon in lots of big carnivorous groups. So perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised. What's really quite nice, again, is that we actually have the evidence for that.
Okay, Joe, do we have another question over here?
Did Tyrannosaurus Rex, did they lose their teeth?
Yeah, great question. So I mentioned earlier about teeth falling out and coming out and being jammed into other things, but actually they're on a cycle of constantly changing their teeth. We have 2 sets of teeth in our lifetime. Some rare people have 3, but that's about it. Dinosaurs, and particularly things like tyrannosaurs, change their teeth about every 3 months. So every 3 months, they've replaced their teeth. And so actually, if you look at Queenie down here, you can actually see she's got some gaps. Teeth came out all the time. Often when we find feeding marks, we find shed teeth alongside them. What basically happens is that the joint between the root and the crown basically kind of pinches away, and then the root actually basically dissolves and is reabsorbed, and then you've got a very, very big but very, very loose tooth sitting in the jaw, and then it doesn't take much biting on something for it to fall out. It's also the reason that tyrannosaur teeth, or dinosaur teeth generally, are really, really common. Queenie might have been 25 when she died. She had 60 teeth in her mouth, and she changed them every 3 months. She produced hundreds and hundreds of teeth in her lifetime. And they're all coated in enamel, so they're much, much stronger than bone, and nothing really eats enamel. So it's very, very easy to find dinosaur teeth because they produced loads of them.
Excellent. Do we have another question up here?
Yeah.
Where am I looking?
Here.
Hello.
Was the guanlong related to the Dilophosaurus?
Right, good question. So that's something that people thought early on, actually. It was actually suggested that guanlong might be close to a thing called Monolophosaurus. So Dilophosaurus, 2-crested reptile, 2-crested dinosaur. There's another thing from China called Monolophosaurus because it just has one big crest in the middle. And it was briefly suggested that guanlong might be close to Monolophosaurus, but it isn't. And these crests that we actually see in a few dinosaurs turn up in various ones. So actually here's guanlong on the cover. Monolophosaurus has something similar. Dilophosaurus has something similar, but 2. There's a thing called Cryolophosaurus from Antarctica that has this kind of big flange in the middle. And actually, even the bigger tyrannosaurs, it doesn't show up too clearly. They do kind of have these expansions over the eyes, and those fused nasals we talked about in the middle, they have this really weird, very knobbly surface. And that is something that we know is usually associated with basically a kind of horny growth. So actually, although we often look at these things as being a kind of big, smooth crocodilian head, you can actually add some fairly big bumps of like horn or like material over the eyes and down the snouts of these guys. They actually had quite big crests on their heads. So there's a whole range of these little things that popped up. Again, you can actually just about see there's a nice pair of little spikes here on the Albertosaurus at the top. So there's a whole bunch of little crests in various tyrannosaurs, but Dilophosaurus is a very different group that just acquired the same thing in a different way.
Okay, we have a question at the front here.
How long would a Tyrannosaurus live averagely?
So, well, on average, probably not very long at all, because like the other dinosaurs, they're laying dozens and dozens of eggs, and most of those are going to die, either the eggs or the babies, within the first few months. A typical adult, based on all of the big ones that we have where we've aged them, they're about 18 to 20, which actually isn't that old for an animal this size, and in part because they grew so quickly. It's worth pointing out at this point, if anyone's wondering how on earth we age them, actually you can literally cut the bones in half and count the rings. It's not just trees, lots of animals have this as well, and happily so too do dinosaurs. They're basically growing continually, but in winter growth basically slows down, therefore the bony growth isn't as quick, and therefore it leaves a little line, and you can just count the lines.
Okay, do we have one more question on the side here?
How long would it take for a Tyrannosaurus egg to hatch?
Wow. Until very recently, I'd have said a couple of months, give or take, would have been my best guess. But there was a paper published by some guys in America just very recently, and they suggested, so bigger eggs take longer to hatch. Ostriches take longer than chickens, which take longer than hummingbirds. And they suggested that even things like Protoceratops that I mentioned earlier, an animal only about 2 meters long, so not even as big as this desk, they might take 6 months to hatch, or even longer. And bigger eggs might take longer still. That implies something like Tyrannosaurus might be looking at something like 9 months for an egg to hatch. This is an enormously long period of time. This really changes how we have to think about some of these animals, because they're living through winters like a modern winter now. That implies that their eggs overwintered somehow, or they laid them right at the start of spring, but then the offspring didn't hatch until the snow started falling. A mum and dad guarding them for half, 3/4 of a year. We really don't know. So this is a fascinating new insight into dinosaurs, and it's the earliest days of our understanding. We do not know where this is going. Maybe the ones they looked at just happened to be weird, but it doesn't look that way. It looks like most dinosaurs had a very long incubation period for their eggs.
Okay, we've got another question. The gentleman in the black jumper here.
How deep can you find? How deep until you can find a dinosaur bone?
Right. Yeah. So dinosaurs can be buried deep underground. Basically, we can't find them unless they're in some way close to the surface. It's just about possible, but extremely expensive to try and use things like radar and sonar that shoot into the ground. Basically, because they're looking for differences in density, and bones are actually about the same density as rocks. You don't find anything. So what we actually do is we literally walk around and look for bits of bone, and what you're looking for, ideally, is something that's just coming out of a hillside, because that means that the rest of the skeleton is in it. What's always depressing as a paleontologist when you come across, and I have done this, a huge field of bones, because that's something that's been sat out on the surface for a long time, and it's kind of gone. I once found something that was probably about the size of Diplodocus, and the single biggest piece of bone was about this big. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of chunks of rock, and you couldn't even begin to glue it back together. The whole thing looked like it'd been smashed with a hammer and then run over and then part dissolved in acid. And had we been there probably 6 months earlier, we might have had a complete skeleton. So what you really want is a bit of bone sticking out of the hill, and you dig around that and pull it out. And if it looks good, you dig in a bit further, and hopefully there's some bone, and then you go in a bit further. When you're lucky, that's at the top of a hill. When you're unlucky, it's at the bottom of a hill, and then you have to take the hill out. And people do. And in the States in particular, these areas with dinosaurs are often national preserves. You're not even allowed vehicles off-road. So that literally means that if you have a fossil site that's 6 or 7 miles from the nearest road, you hand carry all your food, all your water, all your equipment to your site, then you excavate the hill by hand, and then you carry out the dinosaur by hand over land. It's a colossal amount of work.
Okay, Joe, do we have another one up here?
Is there any big differences that are quite obvious between the male and female Tyrannosaurs?
What a great question. So this is one that comes up time and time again. At various times people have said the females are bigger, or that there are kind of 2 different types of Tyrannosaurus rex. There's like a bigger one or a stronger, what's called the robust one, and then the thin or gracile one. The truth of the matter is there really isn't a lot of difference between them. There's more of a smear. A friend of mine has just published a paper on this showing that actually you can't tell them apart. There certainly were males and females, and actually we can identify some females, and it comes down to the bone again. If as a reptile or a bird you're laying an egg, eggshell is made of calcium. It's basically the same stuff as your bones. And the way these eggs are produced is actually, they're really quite fully developed. And then virtually at the last minute, like within a few hours, the eggshell is put on and then they lay it. So that means you need, for an egg this big, you need a lot of calcium very quickly. So what they do is during the breeding season, they grow this special layer of bone on some of their big bones, things like the thigh bone, upper arm bone, and a few of the others. And it has a really, really weird texture. So if you see this, you have to cut into the bone to see it, but if you see this, you know it's a female who's about to lay eggs. And we now have at least 2 different Tyrannosaurus specimens where we can cut in, look at the bone, and tell it's a female about to lay eggs. So we know we have them. The problem is if you don't have that, maybe it's a male, but maybe it's a female who's not laying eggs because it's the wrong time of year, or she was ill that year, or something, or maybe she's just laid them and it's wrong. So there are a couple of females. If the others are male or female, we don't know. And unfortunately, we may never know because it's actually really quite hard to tell. And mysteriously, and I've never understood this myself, museums get really upset when you turn up with a saw and say that you'd like to cut through a chunk of every single Tyrannosaurus they have. For some reason, they don't like it. And that really does limit research sometimes.
Okay, we've got time for 2 more questions. First of all, we'll have the girl with the grey hat here, please.
Excuse me.
How many eggs did Tyrannosaurus hatch?
We really don't know. Unfortunately, we've never found any eggs for Tyrannosaurus or any of the Tyrannosaurs at all, so we just don't know. My guess is probably quite a lot. When you're an animal, laying eggs, or just having babies generally, you can basically go down one of 2 routes. You can be like an elephant and have one big baby and really look after it. Or you can be like a rat, or more extreme things like crabs and octopus, and have dozens or even thousands, and that's kind of all your effort is just going into producing more and more eggs, and you don't look after them very much. And generally, bigger animals actually tend to go down the looking after them route with smaller, they have not many, and they look after them. But actually, you have a big problem when you get to the big dinosaurs with this, and that's egg size. You can't make an egg bigger than about this, about the size of a normal football or rugby ball. Because if you make it really big, you need a really thick shell, otherwise it just falls apart. And if you make a really thick shell, air can't get in and out, and the baby suffocates. So you're limited. You can't make a bigger egg than this. But dinosaurs get way bigger. I mean, not much bigger than an ostrich egg. So that means things like Diplodocus, and bigger animals like Brachiosaurus, Giraffatitan, Antarctosaurus, 50-ton sauropods, still only lay eggs this big. And that means they're probably laying a lot of eggs. T-Rex is maybe somewhere in between, but it's a lot bigger than an ostrich, and football's not that big compared to an 8-ton animal. So I can't give you a number, but my guess is it's really quite a lot.
Okay, and we have one last question. The gentleman in the white T-shirt up here.
Is it known whether or not tyrannosaurs were social animals or solitary animals?
Oh boy, how long have you got? I could go on about this for days, whether you want me to or not. So, I showed you the Utyrannus where we have a pair. There's a famous site in Alberta of Albertosaurus, where we have multiple specimens of Albertosaurus together, and there is allegedly 1, if not 2 sites in Mongolia where there's multiple evidence of lots of Tarbosaurus together. That has been used by some people to infer some level of social behavior or pack hunting, but personally I'm not skeptical of that. I just think the evidence is actually very weak, because if you look at how modern animals live, just living in a group doesn't necessarily make you a pack hunter. So there's lots of things which tend to live in groups socially, but will then go and hunt on their own. Hyenas actually do this mostly. Meerkats, great hornbills and stuff like this. They're often kind of hunting on their own. Also, we don't know what's caused those groups to come together. We know big groups of bears come together when the salmon are in season, but you won't find a pack of bears roaming the wilderness anytime soon, or any other time of year. Things come together to migrate, things come together to breed, things come together for a glut of food. Who knows? Maybe this is a family group and they were later going to disperse. So I'm certainly not against the idea of social behavior in tyrannosaurs. I'm certainly not against the idea of pack hunting. But I do think just a few clusters or pairs of species or specimens a couple of times is really not great evidence to extend this to complicated social behaviors. I'd want to see quite a lot more.
Fantastic. So a really nice open question to finish with.
Yeah.
It just shows that whilst you've done a lot of work here, there's still so much more to go. And so hopefully maybe in 20 years' time, will be one of you guys standing behind the desk here telling us more about how Tyrannosaurs were social animals.
Let's hope so.
So, a really fantastic talk. So I think we should give one more big round
Thank
of
you.
applause to
Thank you very
David
much.
Hone. Thank you very much.